Greetings from Los Angeles, greetings from Los Angeles County, greetings from the West Coast, greetings from not Tokyo, but on the other side of the world or very close to it. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2023. And that brings us to a title which has been designated by Criterion at spine number 1182. And this is a work which is described as being from the year 1963. And the name of the filmmaker is Joseph Losey. And the name of the work is The Servant. This is the work which is described as being from the year 1963, and it is from the great director Joseph Losey and screenwriter Harold Pinter, based upon the novel by Robin Maugham, and John Dankworth's score, Douglas Slocum cinematography, director of photography, and we have among its really Richard McDonald, production designer, and among its stellar cast, we have people like James Fox and Sarah Miles and Wendy Craig and Dirk Bogarde and others. This is a work which is a real lightning rod of a film that is speaking volumes, I think, and has the potential to speak volumes with regard to its context of 1963, and also speaking volumes potentially, in the context of a viewing in contemporary times in 2023 and beyond. I'm speaking, of course, of this work, which is The Servant, and it comes courtesy of Criterion Collection's Blu-ray, which is right here, and I mentioned at spine number 1182. We will talk a little bit more later on in this video about certain aspects of this Blu-ray release, which is also I have on display here on the screen here, but the menu, I should say. But before we get to some aspects of the Criterion release and the Blu-ray and the special features and the like in the presentation, let us first focus our attention, if I may, on aspects of the story or plot structure of this work, The Servant. And I think we have at its heart, or at its core, a film that is setting the stage for a lot of deceptions, a lot of switches, a lot of what the phrase is switcheroos, things that start in one place and end up becoming or transforming or dissolving or decaying into something quite different. And I use that phraseology, and I think it can be applied in a number of different facets. So, for example, we have the basic premise or setup, which is a young, wealthy, well-to-do gentleman of town. This is the James Fox character, is essentially trying to find a place, and a place that is very much part of the sort of conspicuous wealth, conspicuous consumption. And part of that is hiring a servant. And the servant eventually comes in the form of this character who is portrayed by Dirk Bogarde. And this is Hugo Barrett. And the James Fox character is Tony. And we also understand that, well, this is the basic premise, the basic relationship between Tony and Barrett. So this is James Fox character and Dirk Bogarde's character, respectively. Now, around this, or revolving around this, or affected by this, are a number of other relationships that we see formulate and emerge and indeed transform and decay before our very eyes. One such example is the relationship between Susan and Tony, that is the James Fox character and the Wendy Craig character, respectively. This represents a certain upper crust aspect of London society at the time, 1960s, and also a type of possibility or a type of lifestyle that might be said to be quote unquote part of the upper crust status quo that a potential relationship with Susan seems to be presenting to the James Fox character in terms of a type of perceived stability and also perceived acceptance from certain quarters of class in England at the time. Now, however, there is also intertwined within this very relationship or sub-relationship a notion not just of class, but also of struggle and control and psychological power play, because we see or get hints from the very outset as to a type of sense of control or a sense of, say, relationship dynamic that seems to be established. The Wendy Craig character likes to be in a certain position. I wouldn't necessarily go so far to say domination or domineering, but there is a sense of a place that she perceives herself to have vis-a-vis her relationship with Tony, the James Fox character. Now, this is, I think, worth emphasis because the way in which the relationship between the man about the house, Tony, and his servant, the Dirk Bogarde character, how this core relationship of the film usurps or upsets or potentially destroys, that relationship between Tony and Susan. And it becomes one of the points of intrigue because we see the psychological power play and the dynamic between the person of the house and then the servant. How this power play dynamic forms a type of parallel of psychological power struggle and indeed psychological warfare between human beings that in turn seeks to perhaps destroy relationships around that person. Another way to explain this is what Dirk Bogarde's character as the servant represents, or one of the things it could be said that his character represents is the introduction of chaos, also the representation of chaos, and perhaps the illusion of class structures. And I say the word illusion or I say the word destruction because depending on how one looks at the film The Servant, one can say that this film is either upsetting the apple cart in terms of pre-established class structures, or it is pulling back the curtain to reveal that perhaps these class structures that were perceived to be there were in fact not there, and everything is illusory. And I use this phrase illusory or perhaps destruction because this paves the way for the imbalance of seemingly status quo relationships. So not only do you have the imbalance of the potential relationship between Tony and Susan, but also the introduction of another character, such as the Sarah Miles character, Vera, and her perceived relationship vis-a-vis Barrett. Are they siblings, or is there something else going on? Or was the sibling relationship always there, but something has been warped or transformed or perhaps decayed into something else? What is the case? We're not quite sure, but what we are getting a sense of is that things that we think are part of the quote-unquote norm, part of the quote-unquote status quo, are either upset or destroyed or otherwise revealed to be not there at all, and thus bringing about the metaphor of the reflection of warped reflections in concave or convex mirrors, a refraction of light and images through glass balls that warp and distort images to then give us the notion or suggestion that what we perceive is in fact something that is either being decayed or destroyed from the outside in or the inside out, or something that is revealed to be not there at all in the first place. And that becomes very important when one thinks of, for example, relationship between one class of persons and another class of persons. And this idea of class in the context of economic-based classes is a very key one because it suggests a breakdown of these societal structures that seem to be part of the status quo at the start of the film, but then degrade or transform into something else. Dare I say it, maybe a metaphorical notion of revolution, one class usurping the other. And that could be said to be a type of power dynamic that is on display in the metaphorical relationship between James Fox's character and Dirk Bogarde's character. That's one aspect that's possible reading. Another aspect is the psychological, and that is the power play dynamics, how one human being has the potential of threatening others by essentially asserting one's power. asserting one's influence. And we see these through subtle means, either through changes in the decor and the environment, things like the positioning of flowers in a room, choices about where to go, maybe the destruction or invasion of privacy. These little things that add up to a type of psychological ploy and a way in which actions or activities could be said to have a command over others, and how people have a certain sense of glee in terms of asserting control, and perhaps the people who are being controlled also have a sense of glee. And this goes at the very heart of sort of psychological profiles in human relationships and dynamics. The idea of the feeling of wanting to be in control and also the feeling of wanting to be controlled. And there's no sort of moral comment that's being made via one or the other. It simply is, or it's simply being presented in the context of these characters, I would assert. So this is also very fascinating itself. And also related to that, or parallel to that, how sexuality and maybe emerging ideas and notions of sex, not just how sex is used maybe as a type of power ploy or weapon, but also how sex is indeed innately part of our own means of asserting control and also engaging with the other. How this is used and employed, and indeed also perverted and warped in a way that's also seen to maybe try to gain a sense of status, or gain a sense of destruction, or introduce an element of chaos, or perhaps lend itself towards the institutionalized confusion, the means by which certain societal structures are broken down and destroyed in favor of other things. So sex as a means of unification and union, but also sex as a means of a type of destroying factor or chaotic factor. Now, I use these phrases in these maybe generalized terms because I do want to suggest that this film, The Servant, has this way of being very much contextualized in the context of the 1960s. If we look at the 1960s as a type of period of, say, social upheaval, the emergence of new forms and avenues of social mobility, at the sake of, or at the cost of, say, the breakdown of quote-unquote perceived prior more quote-unquote traditional societal structures. Now, that's one way of looking at this film. Again, another way of looking at this film, as I was trying to suggest earlier, is that this notion of, say, a breakdown of a moral decay, or a transformation of one type of set of existences into another set of existences. And this is all set forth not in a cynical way, but in a very dry, witty sort of way. There is a lot of tension and sexuality on display, a lot of eroticism on display. There's also this way in which things that seem pristine and perfect have a little imperfection about them, have this little sense of a decay or rot, have the sense of being off balance, off kilter. Maybe it's just a piece of hair in Dirk Bogart's otherwise pristinely set hair that's a little bit out of place. Maybe it's the way in which flower arrangement is a little bit off balance in the rest of the room. Maybe it's the way in which the mirror offsets its reflection to suggest something ugly and uncanny beneath the surface. And it's this mood and atmosphere and ambience that builds and builds and builds and builds in a way that is very subtle and very, very quiet at first glance, but then builds in a way that feels like a pressure cooker. And when that pressure cooker bursts forth with the pressure within and underneath, that also sets the stage for the peeling of the surface, the pulling behind of the curtain, the peeling back of the layers to reveal something underneath. Now, whether that thing underneath is described as being ugly or beautiful or magical or transformative or truthful or painfully truthful, or a continuation of the illusion of class and society and the illusion of psychological power and sexuality, or perhaps it's the cold hard truth of all these things and others that is forming the basis of the changing times and aspects of the 1960s, which in turn can be said to be applied to maybe the changing times and aspects of the life and times of 2023. Now, whatever the case may be, this is a maybe frightening portrait. This is also a portrait of unknowns. We are not sure who some of these people are. They say they are from this area, or they say are these types of people, but are they really saying the truths about themselves, or is there something about what it is they're saying, or something about the atmosphere and ambience that makes us not believe everything that might be said to us? And is that saying something about ourselves in terms of igniting with that a certain degree of cold hard cynicism, or is there something more externalized about it that is something beyond our control? I think these and other questions are at the very heart of a viewing of The Servant, and whether one looks at it through the class economic lens, or whether one looks at it through the sexual psychosexual lens, or whether one looks at it through the sort of swinging 60s movement and decay, and whether one wants to employ that and apply that to a reading of this film a la 2023 and beyond, or if one wants to do it in a combination of factors, as well as the aspect of the theater and acting styles, as well as the way in which the apartment setting seems to be warping and changing before our very eyes, from something that is filled with rot and emptiness at the start, but then is filled with a sense of place and being and decoration and decadence that in turn might lead to further decay and rot in a transformative sense as the film progresses. Whether one wants to look at the film in those, say, physical terms, metaphorical terms, or indeed socio-political terms, or all of the above, I think you're in for a very rich and rewarding experience indeed. Not to mention the fact that as these aspects are applied, we're seeing so many ways in which, as I say, the scenes seem to be warping before our very eyes. They seem also to be melting before our very eyes, such that not only do we see curves and shapes and warped dimensions of strange reflections in glass and mirror, but that this also in turn seems to be paralleling how the characters seem to be warping and changing before our very eyes. As I was saying, characters that are together one moment in one aspect or one description of their relationship seem to be broken apart, or their relationship changes before our very eyes. That again could be power-based psychology, it could be sexually based, it could be a combination of those, or it could be based on some other base forms of human emotion, such as love, hate, jealousy, betrayal, whatever the case may be. The need to control, or the need to feel controlled. And these relationship dynamics, as they change before our very eyes, give us the feeling of unease as the viewers, give us the feeling of what is it that we are watching? Is this something that we can rely on in terms of our expectations of what we perceive the status quo to be? Or are we meant to question these perceived notions of status quo to begin with? And if we are indeed meant to question that, then what does that say about us at the end of the day after we finish watching The Servant, when we see what happens to the characters at the end of this film versus how we then are meant to question our perceived notions of what it is the status quo actually means? And I think those and other questions are laid bare in a very compelling and very visually arresting manner. Now, I mentioned the visual cues here, and they're very stunning. And one of the things that's, I think, one of the great strengths of Joseph Losey, as lauded by Imogen Sarah Smith in one of the supplements, is the way in which Joseph Losey really captures the mise-en-scène. And there's such a inextricable link between mise-en-scène and the psychological imbalance of the characters. And this is so important in terms of, say, little things like blocking and the way in which theatrical techniques of blocking are really employed in a cinematic way to showcase the psychological. There's a very famous moment, for instance, where a glass ball is held before the face of a character. And this is very important in terms of how the ball is placed in the frame, but also how this creates a sense of the strangeness of the reflection of the face, and how the strangeness in terms of reflection of the face can be said to be paralleling the quote-unquote strangeness of the psychological decay of the character at that point in the film. So this is an example of mise-en-scène linked directly to the psychology of the character at the moment. And this is, I think, one of the great strengths of Joseph Losey, as voiced by Imogen Sarah Smith and others. And we see this throughout the film. This is a film where you absorb psychology, you absorb the drama, and when you absorb it, it's absorbed in a very uncomfortable way, and it's absorbed in a very arresting way. It's uncomfortable. You can't take your eyes off of the cinema. It's that type of compelling nature. And that's also urged on by the great performances that we have here. I mentioned Wendy Craig, Sarah Miles, who brings this air of a type of mysterious, almost a combination of innocence or perceived innocence, and also a sort of perceived threat or sexual danger. And then we have James Fox, who seems to also have his sense of innocence from his perspective, but also there's a sense of maybe almost risky naivete on his part, which is then taken to a certain degree by the introduction of the Dirk Bogarde character, who also may or may not have his own agenda, may or may not have his own set of rules that may or may not be revealed as the film progresses. And so those characters that are combined essentially under the roof of this, again, immaculately designed apartment, living quarters, I think form the essential heart and soul of this very twisty film, a film that is very creepy and very unsettling, and also speaks to various points in time, 1960s and also 2023. It speaks to economy and class. It also speaks to power dynamics. It also speaks to the very threat of the presence or the other, but that threat can also be very alluring and attractive. So where does that leave us at the end of the day when we are attracted by that which we know is very threatening? Aha, therein lies one of the great dilemmas of a type of existential dilemma that is embodied so brilliantly in a work like this, in the hands of Harold Pinter, in the hands of Joseph Losey, in the hands of Dirk Bogarde, James Fox, Sarah Miles, Wendy Craig, and others, in this brilliant work. Creepy, unsettling, and oh so bold indeed. This is the work which is The Servant. The Criterion Collection has released this film, The Servant, on this Blu-ray, this single disc Blu-ray edition at spine number 1182, and this is purported to be based on a new 4K digital restoration with uncompressed monaural soundtrack. Now, let's speak very briefly about this aspect of the release, which is the fact that it's the new 4K digital restoration. The insert, which is what I have here, I've taken the liberty of removing that. I like that parallel between the way that the insert looks and the artwork for the Blu-ray menu, as well as the artwork for the cover art design here. We'll speak a little bit about that later on in this video. But according to this leaflet, with regard to the master, it says, about the master, The Servant is presented in its original aspect ratio of 1.66 to 1. Undertaken by Studio Canal, this 4K restoration was created from the 35mm original camera and soundtrack negatives at Silver Salt Restoration Limited in Slough, England. Disc Mastering Pixelogic Media. So this is purported to be based on this new 4K digital restoration undertaken by a great team over at Studio Canal. And this is a great presentation. It looks great on this Blu-ray, and it looks and sounds great on this Blu-ray. And I've seen this film a number of times, but I've never seen it look this good. So on the one hand, I'm very happy with how this looks, and I'm very happy with the availability of this by Criterion under the form of this North American Blu-ray release from the fine team over at Criterion. Now, with that praise, which I think is very deserving, directed towards Criterion, I must say that for those of you who know, there is also a really wonderful release, a 4K release by Studio Canal. And this is, I think, a UK release. And you can get that if you have the ability to watch the 4K, again, and the ability to get that UK release. And that release also has, I think that release is based upon, or this Blu-ray from Criterion is also based upon the same restoration as that release. That's my understanding anyway. And also that release, the Studio Canal release, is packed with a number of supplements that are really great. Most or some, not all, are mirrored here. And there are a couple that are only found on the Criterion release that aren't found elsewhere. And we'll talk a little bit about the supplements later. But the point is that Criterion, for whatever reason, has released this purported to be based on the same Studio Canal 4K restoration, but on a Blu-ray. Now, for those who are okay with that, I think that's fine. And again, as I mentioned, the Blu-ray option here, it looks and sounds quite fantastic. Though, it does beg the question, of course, oh, wouldn't it have been nice for Criterion to have been able to release this in this North American release, also with the option of the 4K? Now, I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure why Criterion wasn't able to do so now. It seems like it was possible with other non-Criterion releases, but not here. One can only speculate. Again, I'm not in the room. I'm not in the know, so I don't have inside baseball information about this sort of thing. So I can only speculate. Maybe it has to do with certain timing of rights. Maybe it has to do with certain restrictions of rights based on the geographical regions. Perhaps one can even speculate that maybe The Servant might get a 4K UHD Blu-ray release from Criterion in the future. Who knows? I don't know. Again, your guess is as good as mine. But the point is that at this point in time anyway, it does seem conspicuous that Criterion's Blu-ray release was made here, whereas across the pond, there seems to be a sort of a release that seems to be, in terms of, if one is to look at it in terms of physical media technology, it's employing a technology that is perceived, generally speaking, to be quote-unquote more advanced, end quote. And so it does seem conspicuous in that way. Now, in that conversation, one might prefer the non-Criterion release over this Criterion release. And if you feel that way, that's perfectly valid. That's perfectly fine. This might be an area, too, where, again, one might question why was this happening to Criterion at the time. And again, I can only speculate. I personally don't look at it as too much of a knock. From my perspective against Criterion. It might be seen as, again, comparing one release over the other, and maybe in the eyes of many, the non-Criterion release might win out at the end of the day, which is perfectly fine. But it is conspicuous that this is happening in this form, whereas it is happening in other forms elsewhere. But one can only speculate as to the reason why, and that doesn't take away from the fact that we're still getting a very valid and striking presentation, again, on this Blu-ray format. And I must say, too, that from my own personal feelings of this film, I've never seen this film look so great as it does with the Studio Canal restoration. In the hands of Criterion in this Blu-ray, or if you're going to opt for the non-Criterion release, that's, of course, I think also a great way to go. But in any event, if you do opt for the Criterion Blu-ray release, you are going to get the Blu-ray. It's purported based on this restoration on the Blu-ray format, but I don't think it's not such a wide degree of difference in my view. There are some differences too in terms of availability of supplements, but overall, I am very pleased. Is it the absolute quote-unquote technically advanced version that you might get? Probably not. But does that make it bad? No, I think it makes it still quite good indeed. So if you're looking for the absolute best jam-packed release, maybe the Criterion release isn't the way to go. Maybe you might want to go elsewhere. But if you're looking for a very good, respectable release that still looks great in terms of my eyes and my ears, then I think you'll be happy with this Criterion release of The Servant. So I find myself, again, happy, perhaps somewhat perplexed, but otherwise, at the end of the day, still happy in terms of how this is handled in the context of this release from Criterion. And now let's turn our attention to the supplements. And as you can see from the menu, you can go to the supplements sub-menu and you press on that, and that'll bring you to the list of the supplements. And I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 supplements selections, and within those, actually, you might get further ones. For example, there's one on the actors, and it brings you to a further sub menu of various. There are four interviews here that are included as part of that actors section. But before we get to that, let us speak about what we have in the other parts of the supplements. Now, as I mentioned before, there is another non-Criterion release that does have a number of supplements, many of which overlap with this. There are a couple that don't. And so that goes both ways, I should say. So if you're looking for maybe a complete take on the Servant, maybe my suggestion is maybe consider getting both the Criterion and non-Criterion releases over the course of, say, the release history of this film, if you are interested. But that's not to take anything away from what's included on the Criterion set in terms of supplements, which I think are really great indeed, and I'll try to explain why. I feel that way. First up is a supplement which is a Criterion produced one. This is approximately 21 minutes, and this is described as being from 2023. This is The Look of Losey, and this is a one-on-one discussion with the great Imogen Sarah Smith. I am a huge fan of Imogen Sarah Smith. I think she does some fantastic work in terms of the academic approach that is very accessible, that's very easy to understand. She has this way of presenting so much great detail and information that's very accessible and has a wonderful through line and trajectory in terms of how she explains data and information. And among her very many areas of expertise is an understanding, a great and exquisite and wonderfully commanding understanding of the cinema of Joseph Losey. And so here we have a discussion of Losey and what could be said to be a progression of Losey's career, both biographically and also in terms of his professional career and the ups and the downs that occurred in both realms. So she talks about the circumstances surrounding his upbringing in childhood, that his family and background was one of wealth and prestige, but that experienced a sense of, say, loss of fortunes. She describes it as a downward mobility tract, which she also describes Joseph Losey as never quite getting over. He seems to be described as always recollecting or often recollecting the glory days prior to the loss of fortunes of his family. So he seems also to understand or maybe have experiences with respect to states of impoverished state, and also highly educated and during and after his education, he is engaged in theater and the cinema, and also his early start in his career finds himself with various notable works in the Hollywood context. Prowler and the Boy with the Green Hair, etc. And this description that Imogen Sarah Smith uses, film noir and social realisms combined during this period. Very fruitful during the period of 1948 to about 1951. And then we have the period where he is essentially out of the United States due to his being essentially targeted by the House Un-American Activities, and so essentially being exiled, excuse me, being exiled essentially to outside of the United States. And so he finds himself in various parts of Europe where he still continues to engage with and make cinema. And that also brings him at a certain point of his career to London and to the United Kingdom, where he then encounters the circumstances that lead to the production and the creation of this work, The Servant. So in this manner, Imogen Sarah Smith also describes how Losey, oftentimes in the latter part of his career, found himself in, say, places outside of the U.S. where he's making films. Sometimes he's making films in a language other than English. For example, there's another great work by Joseph Losey called Monsieur Klein, Mr. Klein or Monsieur Klein, which is also, by the way, seen in a great release by Criterion on a Criterion physical media release several months back. That's in a language other than English. The French language. And Imogen Sarah Smith reminds us that indeed Joseph Losey wasn't fluent in French, but he was able to direct this film in a language that was in French or that's not in English. And so this shows the great strength of Joseph Losey, in her words, as a type of visual communicator who's able to use setting and decor to his advantage. Again, she uses the phrase mastery of the mise en scène. And this also leads to her discussion of the important relationship he has with Richard McDonald, the production designer, whose work can be seen in the film The Servant, who's credited as a production designer on this film. And the description about the way in which the set decoration and the environment is used in The Servant, this very key location of the apartment rooms or this living quarters. This idea of when you go in, you stay in. The idea being you're swept in, you're hypnotized by the place. Indeed, when you're captured by the place, it sort of decays and warps around you. Real and the surreal. This is also a very important juxtaposition that Imogen Sarah Smith points to. The idea of a sense of reality on the one hand, but maybe punctuated by certain details that seem almost surreally out of place. And so the idea of, say, a seemingly normal setting like in The Servant, but then suddenly punctuated by this very fisheye lens type of mirror that has this kind of frightening way of stretching out reflections. And so we have her discussion of Joseph Losey's style in the context of Monsieur Klein and film Trout and Eve, as well as The Servant. So we get a kind of primer in many points of Joseph Losey's career. Not all of the films are discussed, but many highlights are discussed, including The Servant. So this is, I think, also serving as a great primer introduction into the world of Losey. There's also a mentioning of the great work that Losey had in terms of his collaboration with Alexander Trauner, his appreciation of certain aspects of Brecht, and the idea too of symbols and images of sitting and standing in his many films, such as The Servant. Imogen Sarah Smith reminds us too about how important scenes are where you see one character sitting or the other character standing, the metaphorical significance of characters in this recumbent position, as she describes it. Walls and mirrors. Sometimes we'll see walls that have the leftover residue of paintings that were once on the wall but are removed. Mirrors that again serve to show a parallel or a melting or decaying aspect of the psychology inside, etc. So this is one of the highlights of the Criterion release, right? This is one of the Criterion exclusive takes, and so Imogen Sarah Smith, whenever she appears on a Criterion release, you know you're in for a wonderful conversation, and this is no exception to that. She has a great expertise over the works of Losey, and she is able to guide us through a type of cinematic through line throughout the many highlights of Losey's career, including The Servant. So it's also, I think, very exciting too. When you watch this, you want to watch many of the other Losey films as well. So that's a great thing that Imogen Sarah Smith is able to do. So please check out this wonderful discussion. Again, one of the great, I think, appealing points of this Criterion release is the inclusion of this wonderful discussion with Imogen Sarah Smith. And this is The Look of Losey, approximately 21 minutes. And then we have Losey on The Servant, and this is a 1976 audio interview. It's approximately 29 minutes with Michel Simon. And here we have, again, total sort of overview. If we look here, for example, I'll scroll down here, we get this backdrop here. And this is the screen that you have, and I have the audio down volume, so you can't hear it, unfortunately, but if you do have the disc and you play it, you will hear the audio interview with Losey. And here we have discussions about the inspiration for the film, working with Harold Pinter, working with the actors, Dirk Bogarde, a very key collaborator with Joseph Losey, working with Sarah Miles. There's an interesting anecdote that he shares with regard to James Fox and Sarah Miles. He has some very, I think, honest takes about some of the performances. For example, with regard to Wendy Craig, although he does admit that, I think, for what it's worth, her presence is very, very key, and she does a very fine job in a role that perhaps, from his perspective, may not necessarily have suited her and her positioning at the time, her career at the time. Nevertheless, I think it's a very, well-suited role in terms of the discomfort that's on display, especially when we consider the relationship between her character and that of James Fox's. So, and the idea too of the design of the film, the legacy, and the certain themes of class and power and psychology and sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. So, and also how this is very much a film that might be said to be made on a quote-unquote outsider status, and that'll come up a little bit later. That came up in the discussion with Imogen Sarah Smith, but we also get the sense here. And also just to hear Losey's voice and to get a sense of the type of person that he is when he's speaking about his own work. Very down to earth. There's almost a type of stone cold precision that he employs when he's speaking, which I think is it's very commanding. So this is, I think, a very valuable, very valuable interview indeed, again, straight from Losey himself. So this is Losey on The Servant, the audio interview, which is approximately 29 minutes. Now, let us go back to the supplements here. And we have a number of other supplements. So next up we have, let me just go back here to the main, there we go. The next supplement we have is Harold Pinter, Screenwriter. And this is a supplement which is approximately 23 minutes. This is described as being from 1996. And this is a type of on-stage interview or question-answer interview at the London NFT. And this is with Michael Billington. And as I say, it's not, from 1996. And this is really wonderful because Harold Pinter, of course, is a very key collaborator with Joseph Losey and, of course, The Servant, talking about the adaptation of the Robert Malm novel. His choice to not employ first-person narration or narrative, and how he makes a distinction between first-person narrative on the one hand and voiceover in cinema on the other. It's a really interesting distinction. And also he mentions the significance of this film and also the significance in the context of other films. The Go-Between is mentioned. Accident is mentioned. If you haven't had a chance to see any of those other films, oh gosh, you've got to check out those other films as well. And also in the context of The Servant, wow, what a great triple feature that is. And also Harold Pinter describes working with Joseph Losey. And also he describes early on in the discussion about how Harold Pinter was so into cinema, how much he loves film, seeing a lot of movies growing up. He mentions with great affection the works of Buñuel, for example. He also mentions with great affection other examples of cinema like the Oxbow Incident. Just watching a lot of movies, he mentions. Wells is also mentioned in the conversation, etc. And this also goes towards the conversation about working with Joseph Losey and the actors. So this is so wonderful. I'm glad this is included. Harold Pinter is, of course, a very, very key figure in the context of this work, The Servant. So please check this out if you can. It's approximately 23 minutes. And then we have the section which is right here, the actors. And let me once again press the button to reveal that this has 4 options. The first is with interview with Dirk Bogarde, which is approximately 11 minutes. This is from 1992, and this is essentially Dirk Bogarde talking about meeting Joseph Losey, his first impressions of Joseph Losey, and working with Joseph Losey, and the great run of films that they had, a type of critical and commercial and artistically successful run of films that they had, including The Servant. And so, and just to hear Dirk Bogarde's comments, absolutely fascinating. So that's the first interview here. That's 11 minutes from 92. And then the next one we have is the discussion between Richard Ayoade and James Fox So this is approximately 47 minutes. This is from 2013. And they're sitting together. They have a very close personal, actually familial relationship as well. But they're also speaking here in terms of James Fox's background and the story behind the servant, and sort of the test of the servant, and working with actors like Sarah Miles, and having the personal relationship that he had with Sarah Miles at the time, working with Joseph Losey and Dirk Bogarde. The temperament of Joseph Losey is mentioned here. It's a very interesting aspect. There's this suggestion that Joseph Losey may have been somewhat standoffish in certain aspects, in terms of his temperament on set or working with that, which is very fascinating, which I think isn't suggesting anything negative per se, but it's just suggesting a type of maybe almost a command and confidence, which I think is shown on screen with a great deal of precision, a coolness and precision, what I think is so apropos of a work like The Servant. So this discussion with James Fox is wonderful. This is very robust and wonderfully long, so it's approximately 47 minutes. And then next up we have a one-on-one discussion with Sarah Miles. This is 11 minutes. Again, wonderful behind-the-scenes discussion. Sarah Miles, where she was at that point in her career, when she was able to get this role, working with James Fox. Again, there's a personal relationship there as well as a professional relationship, working with Dirk Bogarde, working with Joseph Losey, and Joseph Losey in his career at the time, early 1960s. Oh, this is great. It's 11 minutes. It goes by so quickly, but it's definitely worth it if you can check it out, the interview with Sarah Miles. And then there's one more interview with Wendy Craig. This is even shorter. It's only 6 minutes. I wish it could have been longer. This is also great. Wendy Craig plays another key character in the film, and it's interesting again to see how she got the role, working on set, working with, in particular, Dirk Bogarde and James Fox, and then Joseph Losey, etc. And such a wonderful demeanor, wonderful temperament that she displays here. So that's the fourth of the actors' interviews that are included here. And then we have the inclusion of the trailer, which rounds out the supplements. So what I can say is we aren't getting all of the supplements that have ever been created when it comes to this film, The Servant. And I can say too that, for example, we don't get, I think we get some discussion points, but not that many discussion points. Some discussion points are brought up with respect to, say, the work of Douglas Slocum, the director of photography, but I would have liked to have seen more. Same thing too about the importance of the contribution of John Dankworth's music. There's some mentioning of it here and there, but it would have been nice to have seen more of that. There is mentioning of Richard McDonald's contribution as production designer, as Imogen Sarah Smith, I think, so rightly pointed out. But it would have been nice to see other aspects of the production highlighted in the context of these Criterion supplements. And if you're looking for other aspects, you might want to look elsewhere in terms of a completionist approach to all the supplements that are in existence out there with respect to The Servant. But that being said, what we do get here is a great focused discussion on Joseph Losey, a sort of primer survey of his work and the through line in terms of the Joseph Losey style as discussed by Imogen Sarah Smith. Also words from Joseph Losey himself, and also just perspectives from the actors, as well as Harold Pinter as well. So we get many of the components, not all of the components, but many of the components that I think make up the greatness that is The Servant, that are embodied here in this set of supplements. So this is what we get. Again, if you're interested in a more robust, complete package, you might want to consider looking at other non-Criterion options, but for what it's worth, the Criterion selection here, I think, is very, very good, very serviceable, and what we do get is, I think, outstanding. So, and it's definitely a great place to start and to springboard into further explorations into the background and concepts and interpretations of this work, The Servant. And now let us look at what I think is one of the great strengths, actually, of the Criterion release. I love this artwork, and I love this look of this almost, and I mean this very complimentarily, this almost grotesque depiction of these characters in this painterly way. I love this. It's displayed here on this cover art design. It's also displayed in the artwork here. That's for the sub menu or the Blu-ray menu. We also get a little bit of it in the context of the fold out here, and I'll speak to that momentarily. But about the artwork, we have art director Sarah Habibi, Eric Skillman, illustration Sterling Hudley. And again, I love this. It's, I think, purposefully grotesque, which is so apropos and so, I love this font too. This brown, blue, dare I say it, brown with teal. And I think it works sublimely. Well done indeed. I like this look of and feel of this. And then I mentioned the fold out here. I'm not a fan of the fold out. I've mentioned that before, and I'll say it again. I'm not a fan of the fold out. I wish this could have been the staple booklet type, but no matter, because we do get a wonderful essay, and I apologize for my poor presentations, but I hope you can forgive me for that. But we do get a fold out with the great essay, and this is an essay which is called A Cruel Servility. And this is from the writer Colm Tóibín, and this hits all the points in terms of the role of this film in the context of Losey's career, what happened to Losey's career and his life in the 1950s, leading to what led him to be in this particular point in the 1960s. The basis of this work, the Mom book, and how Pinter adapted it and made changes to it, focusing in on the psychological power struggles, sexuality, the changing times of the 1960s, attitudes of the sexes and gender, and also the pinpoint accuracy, almost the cold, cruel accuracy of Losey's direction in the context of mise-en-scène and details, and the struggling decay, and how the mise-en-scène is linked inextricably to the psychology of the characters, etc. So this essay is brilliant. A Cruel Servility. So please check it out if you can. Once again, there it is. A Cruel Servility. So with that sense of a cruel servility, we have this overall package from Criterion. Again, it might pale in comparison to, say, other non-Criterion releases, and if you feel that way, I think that's a perfectly reasonable reaction to have. But that doesn't, I think, take away from what we do get with this Criterion release, which is, as I tried to suggest today, very, very good indeed, very admirable indeed, and I learned so much from this release. And it makes me want to learn even more about The Servant and also Joseph Losey and his many other works that were described here, there, and elsewhere. So I think in that regard, the Criterion release did its job quite well. We'll have to wait and see if Criterion has any further plans down the road for this film, maybe new releases, new re-releases of this film. Who knows? I'm not sure. If it doesn't happen, we still have this to rely upon, but if it does happen, again, that's something we can talk about down the road if and when it occurs. But in the meantime, we have this Criterion release of the Joseph Losey classic. Again, this is 1963, and it is the work which is The Servant. All right, my dear friends, so that's it for now, and so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great, great movies, including The Servant. So until the next video, my dear friends, stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.